For 3 days, Branweld had been behaving oddly. It wasn't the kind of odd where a dog might feel unwell or lethargic, but rather the kind where each morning, at first light, he would stand at the corral fence, gazing intently toward the barren desert. His focus was so piercing that it sent a shiver down Caelum Duskvale's spine. The dog refused to eat, play, or even acknowledge the cattle that needed tending. He simply stood there, anticipating something that never arrived until today. This morning, as Caelum opened the cabin door, Branweld dashed out, not towards the familiar watering hole or hunting grounds, but straight into the desolate wasteland where nothing thrived. Caelum had never witnessed his dog run with such urgency, as if his very life depended on reaching an unseen destination. By the time Caelum had saddled his horse and followed the tracks, Branweld was already a tiny dot on the horizon. However, what chilled Caelum's blood wasn't the distance his dog had covered. It was the direction the tracks were leading, toward the old, abandoned steam locomotive. Everyone in the territory knew about the rusted iron beast, half buried in sand and forgotten time, sitting in the middle of nowhere, far from any railway line. Yet no one spoke of how it had ended up there, or why a fully intact train engine would be discarded so far from civilization. The few old-timers who mentioned it would quickly change the subject, as if there was something about that locomotive that respectable folks shouldn't discuss. Branweld had never shown any interest in it before, never even glanced in that direction during their countless rides across the range. But now, as Caelum reached the final ridge, he saw his dog circling the massive engine, sniffing at something near its base. The afternoon sun reflected off the locomotive's brass fittings, casting glints across the desert floor. That's when Caelum spotted something that made his heart race. Fresh footprints surrounded the locomotive, human footprints that weren't his own, bootprints that appeared recent, with sharp edges untouched by the wind. Someone had been there very recently, circling the engine, as if searching for something specific. Caelum dismounted carefully, his boots sinking into the sand with a soft thud that echoed in the desert silence. The locomotive towered before him like a metallic monument to a forgotten past. Its black, iron surface was marred by years of relentless sun. Branweld sat motionless beside the massive driving wheels, his ears perked forward, watching Caelum with an expression that seemed almost human in its desperation. The footprints were clear now, bootprints recent enough that the edges remained sharp, untouched by the wind. Someone wearing worn leather soles had walked a complete circle around the engine, pausing frequently as if searching for something specific. Caelum knelt and pressed his palm against one of the tracks. The sand beneath was still firm, indicating that whoever made these marks had been there within the last day, perhaps even less. His mind raced as he examined the evidence. This was all that remained of his land. The bank had granted him until the month's end to settle his debt, but that deadline was still 3 weeks away. No one should have been out here, least of all near the locomotive that everyone seemed reluctant to mention. Caelum felt his anger rising, pushing aside his usual caution. He had already lost nearly everything. Rustlers had stolen his cattle. Lawyers had challenged his water rights. His wife lay beneath a headstone he couldn't afford to replace. The last thing he needed was strangers trespassing on his property, as if it belonged to them. Suddenly, Branweld stood up and trotted towards the back of the locomotive, his tail stiff and alert. The dog vanished behind the large, tender car, leaving Caelum alone with the growing sense that something was amiss. "Branweld!" Caelum called out, but his voice echoed eerily off the metal surfaces, returning to him altered and empty. There was no response from the dog, but something else caught Caelum's eye. A section of the locomotive's side panel was slightly ajar, revealing a darkness that shouldn't be there. Steam engines didn't have hidden compartments, at least none that Caelum had ever encountered. Yet there it was, a gap in what should have been solid iron, positioned low enough that a man would have to bend to see inside. The footprints led straight to this opening. Caelum approached the gap, his heart pounding in his chest. The metal was icy cold despite the desert heat, and when he looked into the darkness beyond, he detected an unusual scent. It wasn't rust or decay, but something else, something that reminded him of the bank vault back in town. He was about to explore further when Branweld's barking echoed from behind the locomotive. It wasn't his usual bark, but one filled with urgency and warning. Caelum turned around, and that's when he spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. Riders, at least 3 of them, were approaching quickly. Caelum grabbed his rifle from the saddle holster and took cover behind the locomotive's massive boiler. Using the iron beast as a shield, the riders were still too far away to identify, but their haste was clear. They rode swiftly, pushing their horses at a speed that suggested they meant business, not leisure. Branweld emerged from behind the tender car, no longer barking but moving with the controlled intensity of a predator. The dog positioned himself between Caelum and the approaching riders, his hackles raised in a way Caelum had only seen once before. When a pack of wolves had threatened the cattle through the gaps in the locomotive's undercarriage, Caelum watched the dust cloud grow larger. 3 riders, possibly 4. They knew exactly where they were going, riding in a straight line towards the locomotive, without any of the hesitation someone would show if they were merely exploring. A metallic taste of fear filled Caelum's mouth as a chilling thought struck him. These individuals hadn't stumbled upon the scene by chance. They were aware of the locomotive, its concealed compartment, and possibly its contents. The tracks he discovered weren't left by idle wanderers, but by scouts. This realization sparked unsettling questions. How long had they been observing him? How long had they known about the secret held within this old engine? And why were they acting now, when his financial struggles had reached a point where losing his land seemed unavoidable? Caelum leaned against the warm metal, attempting to steady his breath. The banknote was due in just 3 weeks. But perhaps that wasn't mere coincidence. Perhaps someone wanted him removed, wanted him to forfeit this land so they could seize whatever was hidden in the locomotive without obstruction. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Caelum could now hear voices, though the words were still indistinct. Branweld's ears twitched towards the noise, and the dog's stance shifted from protective to aggressive. Whatever was approaching, Branweld sensed a threat. Caelum glanced around the boiler's edge and caught his first clear view of the riders. The man at the front wore a black hat and rode with the assurance of someone who claimed ownership of all he surveyed. Behind him, 2 others kept pace, their hands resting casually on their sidearms in a manner that hinted at familiarity with violence. The lead rider reined in his horse about 50 yards from the locomotive and remained still for a moment, scanning the area as if reading signs. Then he turned to one of his companions and said something that elicited a laugh, though it was far from pleasant. That's when Caelum understood they already knew of his presence. The lead rider cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, his voice echoing clearly across the desert air. "Caelum Duskvale, no need to conceal yourself. We've been anticipating your discovery." Caelum felt his throat tighten. They knew his name, which meant this wasn't a random encounter. These men had come specifically for him, and they were aware of his discovery within the locomotive. He tightened his grip on his rifle, trying to formulate a response. "See no reason to hide," Caelum replied, stepping out from behind the engine but keeping his weapon at the ready. "This is my property, and you're trespassing." The lead rider chuckled and urged his horse closer, stopping just beyond rifle range. He was older than Caelum had initially thought, perhaps 50, with gray streaks in his dark beard and a face weathered by decades of harsh living. "Your property," the man remarked. "That's intriguing, considering you're just 3 weeks away from the bank seizing it." The words struck Caelum like a physical blow. How could this stranger know about his financial difficulties? The bank dealings were supposed to be confidential, but clearly the news had spread further than he'd realized. "I'm Nolan Stonegraves," the man said, making himself comfortable in his saddle. "Perhaps my name rings a bell. I oversee acquisitions for specific clients, individuals who have their eyes on this particular stretch of desert." Caelum had encountered the name in hushed tones within saloons and general stores. Stonegraves was the type of man who materialized when someone needed an issue resolved discreetly. He operated on behalf of affluent investors from the eastern states, men who purchased struggling ranches and mining claims for a fraction of their value. "I couldn't care less who you work for," Caelum retorted. "You're still on private property." "That locomotive behind you," Stonegraves remarked, dismissing the accusation. "Quite an impressive machine. Wouldn't you agree? However, here's an interesting fact. According to the railroad company's records, this specific engine was reported missing 15 years ago. It vanished from the tracks one night, along with whatever it was carrying." Caelum felt a knot form in his stomach. A stolen locomotive would account for why it was abandoned in the middle of nowhere and why the locals avoided discussing it. But it also implied that whatever was concealed inside might be stolen as well. "The individuals I represent have been remarkably patient," Stonegraves carried on. "They've been biding their time, waiting for the opportune moment to reclaim what is rightfully theirs, waiting for the current landowner to reach a point of desperation where they might see reason." Branweld inched closer to Caelum, his body taut and prepared for any trouble. Caelum could sense the gravity of his predicament closing in around him like a trap. These men were aware of his debts, knew about the locomotive, and had timed their arrival flawlessly. "What is it that you want?" Caelum inquired. Stonegraves offered a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I want you to step away from that locomotive and return to your cabin. Act as if you never saw anything here. In return, my employers might be inclined to assist with your financial burdens. And if you decline, then we'll be having this conversation again after the bank takes possession of your land. Except next time, you won't be the owner of the ground beneath our feet." Caelum assessed the 3 men, weighing his chances and the distances between them. Stonegraves sat his horse with the ease of someone who held all the advantages, while his 2 companions fanned out slightly, forming a triangle that would be challenging to escape. These weren't ordinary thieves or drifters. They operated with military-like precision, and their horses were well cared for and trained. "You seem to be well informed about my affairs," Caelum observed. "How can I be certain you can follow through on your promises?" "Because we already have," Stonegraves responded. "Who do you think persuaded the bank to extend your deadline from last week to the end of the month?" "My employers wanted time to address this matter properly." The realization struck Caelum like a blow. He had been relieved when the bank manager had unexpectedly agreed to the extension, believing his fortune was finally changing. Instead, he had been manipulated, given just enough leeway to ensnare himself. The freight in that train, Stonegraves went on, was en route to a mint in San Francisco when it vanished. It was a highly specific shipment that my employers have been pursuing ever since. They're not driven by a desire for vengeance or justice, merely retrieval. Caelum's heart began to race. A mint implied precious metals, likely gold or silver, enough to resolve his financial woes, perhaps even enough to secure his future, but it also meant these men would not hesitate to kill for it. "I haven't taken anything," Caelum stated cautiously. "Not yet," Stonegraves conceded. "But we've been observing this area for 3 days, ever since the desert winds changed and started carrying the scent of old metal from this direction. Your dog picked up on it as well, didn't he? Animals are attuned to such changes." Rex's ears pressed flat against his head, and the dog stepped forward, positioning himself directly between Caelum and the mounted men. Something in the animal's stance had shifted, becoming more aggressive, more protective. The recent heat had finally loosened something in that old engine, Stonegraves explained. It had been sealed tight for 15 years. But metal expands and contracts. Your dog sensed the change in the air before you did. Caelum stayed silent, but his thoughts raced. If these men had been watching him for days, they might know more about the locomotive's contents than he did. They might even know how to open whatever was sealed inside. "This is what's going to happen," Stonegraves declared, his voice hardening. "You're going to show us what your dog found. Assist us in retrieving what belongs to our employers, and then you're going to forget this ever happened. In return, your debt will be erased, and you'll keep your land." "And if I refuse?" One of Stonegraves's companions shifted in his saddle, his hand inching closer to his sidearm. "Then you'll have an accident out here in the desert." A tragic thing. A man thrown from his horse so far from help. It might be days before anyone finds the body. Caelum felt sweat trickling down his back despite the desert heat. These men weren't making empty threats. They had the air of professionals who had dealt with problems like this before. But something else troubled him. If they knew about the hidden compartment, if they'd been planning this for weeks or even months, why did they need him at all? Unless whatever was inside the locomotive required more than just knowledge to open. Unless it required something specific that only he could provide. Caelum lowered his rifle slightly, making a deliberate decision. "What makes you think I can open something your people couldn't figure out in 15 years? Stonegraves exchanged a glance with one of his companions before responding. "Because the compartment isn't just hidden. It's locked with a mechanism that requires a specific key. A key that was supposed to be destroyed when the locomotive was stolen. But we have reason to believe it survived." "I don't have any key," Caelum said. Stonegraves responded, perhaps unwittingly. "However, your late wife, Sylvara, had been employed as a bookkeeper for the railroad company before your marriage. She had access to specific records and information that others did not." Caelum felt a chill run down his spine. Sylvara had been gone for 2 years, and he had never heard anyone link her to the missing locomotive. She had worked for the railroad briefly, but only in the town office, managing payroll and supply orders. Sylvara never mentioned anything about a stolen train. Caelum asserted that she wouldn't have recognized the significance of what she was seeing. Stonegraves clarified that railroad bookkeepers maintained copies of everything: shipping manifests, cargo lists, and, crucially, the combination codes for secure compartments. Your wife likely brought some paperwork home, as most bookkeepers did. She probably mixed it in with household documents, recipes, and letters. Caelum's mind flashed back to the wooden box where Sylvara had kept their important papers, bills, land deeds, and her correspondence with relatives back east. He had never sorted through everything after her death. He couldn't bear to go through her personal belongings. "We conducted a search of your cabin while you were out working with the cattle," one of Stonegraves' men said with a smirk. "We didn't find what we were looking for, but we found evidence that it exists. Your wife was meticulous about keeping records. The intrusion into his home affected Caelum more deeply than the physical threats. These men had been inside his private space, handling Sylvara's things, searching through the few possessions that connected him to happier times." "Where is it?" Stonegraves demanded. "The combination, the key, whatever your wife saved from her railroad work. We know she took something home from that office." Caelum struggled to keep his expression neutral as his thoughts raced. Sylvara had indeed brought work papers home sometimes, but he had assumed they were routine documents. If she had unknowingly saved information about the stolen locomotive, it would explain why these men had orchestrated his financial downfall, why they had waited until he was desperate enough to comply. "Perhaps she did take some papers," Caelum said cautiously, "but I have no idea where they might be now." "Then you'd better start recalling," Stonegraves said, "because my employers are losing patience. They've invested a significant amount of time and money into this recovery operation. We could have approached you directly, but we needed you to discover the compartment first. People are more willing to cooperate when they believe they have something to gain." Branweld suddenly stiffened and growled softly, his attention not on the mounted men, but directed toward the locomotive itself. Caelum followed the dog's gaze and saw something that made his stomach tighten. The hidden compartment door had swung open wider while they had been talking, revealing more of the darkness inside. Something had moved, creating a metallic scraping sound that echoed off the iron walls. The four men pivoted towards the locomotive as the grating noise persisted. The intense afternoon heat had been causing the old iron to expand all day, and the extra motion from their horses had finally dislodged something within the concealed compartment. Through the widened opening, Caelum spotted a gleam of something that was certainly not iron or brass. "Well, look at that," Stonegraves murmured. "It seems the desert is assisting us after all." One of his companions descended from his horse and approached the locomotive, hand on his sidearm. Caelum lifted his rifle, but Stonegraves raised a hand. "Steady now," Stonegraves advised. "There's no need for violence if we all maintain our composure. Arik is simply going to inspect what we've been talking about." Arik reached the locomotive and crouched beside the opening, gazing into the shadows. After a moment, he let out a low whistle. "Boss, you need to see this." Stonegraves dismounted and walked to the compartment, leaving his remaining man on horseback, keeping an eye on Caelum. The setup was clearly strategic, ensuring Caelum was covered while the leaders examined their find. "Well, I'll be," Stonegraves exhaled as he peered inside. "After all these years, it's all still here." Caelum couldn't see what they were looking at, but he could hear the thrill in their voices. Whatever was in that compartment was valuable enough to justify the years of planning and manipulation they had invested. "Here's the issue, though," Arik said, his voice clear in the desert air. "The main container is still securely sealed. We're going to need that combination my mother saved." Stonegraves stood up and turned back to Caelum, his expression hardening. "Change of plans, Duskvale. We're all heading back to your cabin right now, and you're going to find those papers. No more discussions, no more delays, and if I can't find them, then we'll dismantle that cabin piece by piece until we do," Stonegraves declared. "My mother was meticulous. She documented everything, including things she might not have realized were important." Caelum felt the burden of his dire situation. These men had already invaded his home once, and now they wanted him to aid them in doing it again. But he also recognized something they might have overlooked. If Sylvara had indeed saved papers from the railroad office, and if those papers contained the information needed to open the sealed container, then Caelum possessed the only leverage that truly mattered. Stonegraves needed him alive and cooperative, at least until they retrieved whatever was hidden in that locomotive. "All right," Caelum said, making his choice. "We'll go to the cabin, but I want to see inside that compartment first. I want to know precisely what I'm assisting you in stealing." Stonegraves smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Fair enough. But remember, once you've seen it, there's no turning back. You'll be involved in this, whether you want to be or not." Caelum made his way to the concealed compartment of the locomotive, the sand beneath his boots shifting with each step as Stonegraves and Arik moved aside to grant him an unobstructed view. The opening had been widened, now spacious enough for a person to reach inside, and the afternoon sunlight revealed the contents within. There were metal containers neatly arranged in rows, each bearing official stamps that Caelum recognized from his brief stint in freight work before he acquired the ranch. These were the type of sealed transport boxes used by banks and government institutions for transporting valuable goods over long distances. "Silver ingots," Stonegraves murmured. 47 containers, each holding 20 pounds of pure silver, destined for the San Francisco Mint to be minted into coins, more valuable now than it was 15 years ago. Caelum quickly did the math in his head. Nearly 1,000 pounds of silver, enough wealth to purchase 10 ranches the size of his own, enough to secure a man's future or ruin him if the wrong individuals discovered his possession. The locomotive crew was tasked with delivering this cargo and returning with empty containers, Arik added. Instead, they chose to vanish one night, planning to hide in the desert until the pursuit subsided. Unfortunately, they were unaware of the Apache raids occurring in the region at that time. Caelum felt a knot form in his stomach. Everyone in the territory was familiar with the tales from that era. Tales of small groups of travelers who had vanished without a trace, their remains occasionally found years later. The crew never escaped the desert, Stonegraves continued. However, they were clever enough to seal this compartment before their demise, likely hoping that someone would eventually find it and know how to handle it. "Why didn't your employers dismantle the locomotive years ago?" Caelum inquired. "The compartment was designed to open only with the correct combination," Stonegraves explained. "Attempting to force it open would activate internal mechanisms that would destroy the contents. The railroad company engineered these containers to thwart precisely this kind of theft." Caelum examined the sealed containers, now comprehending why these men had gone to such elaborate lengths to manipulate him. They required Sylvara's documents not only to find the combination, but also to ensure they could open the compartment without triggering any built-in security measures. The combinations were stored in 3 locations, Arik clarified. The main office in San Francisco, which was destroyed in a fire in 1891, the personal records of the locomotive engineer, which vanished with him, and the bookkeeper's files, which your wife took home. Branweld edged closer to Caelum. his attention fixed not on the men, but on something else. Caelum followed the dog's gaze and understood what had captured his interest. In the distance, another dust cloud was approaching. This one was larger than the first. "Arik, how many riders are there?" Arik stepped onto the locomotive's running board to get a better look. 5, possibly 6. They were moving swiftly, and Stonegraves muttered a curse. "Those must be my employers, arriving to oversee our work. They weren't expected until tomorrow." Within moments, the riders came into clear view, and Caelum could see that these men were unlike Stonegraves' crew. They were dressed in fine clothes, despite the harsh desert environment, and their horses were worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. These were the Eastern investors, the men who had planned everything. "Stonegraves," the lead rider called out as they neared. "You were instructed to wait for our arrival before proceeding. Plans have changed." "We had no choice, Mr. Brightmore," Stonegraves responded, his voice suddenly deferential. The compartment door opened on its own due to the heat. We had to act swiftly. Brightmore dismounted and approached the locomotive, his gaze immediately drawn to the exposed silver containers. He was a thin man with a pale complexion, suggesting a life spent indoors, but his movements were precise and authoritative. "Have you retrieved the contents yet?" Brightmore inquired. "We need the combination codes first," Stonegraves explained. "They're in documents that Duskvale's late wife kept from her work on the railroad." Brightmore finally turned his attention to Caelum, studying him with a calculating gaze. "Mr. Duskvale, I trust you grasp the seriousness of your situation." Caelum felt the pressure of 6 armed men surrounding him, but he also knew that he possessed something they couldn't seize by force. "I understand that you require something from me," Caelum replied. "Indeed, we do," Brightmore confirmed. "And in return for your assistance, we're willing to offer you a significant reward. Let's say 5% of the recovered silver's value. Nearly 1,000 pounds of silver would still be more money than Caelum had ever seen. Enough to clear his debts and save his ranch. But there was something in Brightmore's tone that suggested any agreement would be fleeting. "There's just one issue," Caelum said. "I no longer have those papers." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind sweeping across the desert. Brightmore's expression remained unchanged, but Caelum could feel the tension radiating from every man present. "Explain," Brightmore demanded softly. "Sylvara was meticulous with important documents," Caelum continued. "She didn't keep them all in one place. She made copies and stored them in various locations. The originals were sent to her sister back east when Sylvara fell ill, along with other family papers. It was a complete fabrication, but Caelum delivered it with the conviction of a man who had nothing left to lose. The truth was that Sylvara's papers were still in their cabin, in the wooden box where she had always kept important documents." Caelum continued, "I recall enough specifics to attempt opening that compartment. Sylvara once demonstrated the railroad's coding system to me, explaining how the combinations functioned. She took great pride in her craft." Brightmore exchanged a look with his crew. "Are you claiming you can open it on your own?" "I'm suggesting I can give it a shot," Caelum responded. "But if I manage it, I want half of the contents. Not just 5%, and I want that agreement in writing, signed by each of you." The ensuing negotiation was swift but heated. Brightmore seemed eager to decline, but the alternative meant confessing to his backers that 15 years of preparation had been thwarted by a single obstinate rancher. Ultimately, they struck a deal. Caelum would endeavor to open the sealed compartment using his understanding of Sylvara's work. If he succeeded, he would be awarded 30% of the retrieved silver, enough to ensure his future stability. The combination Caelum attempted was actually Sylvara's birth date, merged with their wedding anniversary, figures she had used for everything significant in their shared life. When the first container clicked open, displaying rows of shining silver ingots, the gathered men exhaled a collective sigh of relief. 6 months later, Caelum Duskvale was the wealthiest rancher in the territory, his debts settled and his future assured. Stonegraves and his men had moved on to other pursuits, while Brightmoor had returned east with his recovered investment. And in the wooden box where Sylvara had stored their vital documents, the genuine railroad papers remained safely concealed, containing combinations for dozens of other missing shipments that Caelum had chosen to keep as his personal insurance. If this story touched you, give it a like and tell us in the comments. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Subscribe to Frontier Stories and join us as we continue to tell stories of hope, resilience, and the beautiful, messy truth of Wild West.